Welcome and good evening. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day. We acknowledge and celebrate that. We come to you again from Casa, Esther Catholic Worker House in Amarillo, Wisconsin, located on the ancestral grounds of the Winnebago peoples. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative affirms the vision and practice of active nonviolence at the heart of the Catholic Church and appeals to the Catholic Church to recommit to gospel nonviolence. Tonight, we continue to explore the work and research and writings of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative in the second of 5 Monday evenings. Tonight's title is Returning to and Exploring the Power of Nonviolence. It is presented by Marie Dennis and Rose Marie Berger. And so now I would like to turn it over to our moderator for this evening, Anna Wulfekuhle. Anna is, a few words about Anna. Anna is a theater actress. She's also the associate program leader for the Young Adult Outreach Office of the Archdiocese of New York, and also a graduate theology student. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much, David. I'm really excited to be here. And I am especially excited to introduce you all to our two amazing speakers this evening. So our first speaker is Marie Dennis. Marie is the Senior Advisor and past co-president from 2000 to 2019 of Pax Christi International, and she is the program chair of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. She also served 15 years as the director of the Mary Knoll Office for Global Concerns. And in August of this year, she was the recipient of Pax Christi's USA Teacher of Peace Award. And second but not least, Rose Berger has engaged in nonviolent action since the Earth was at 319 parts per million CO2, or 40 plus years of faith-based activism, advocacy, journalism, and pastoral leadership. She is the author of Bending the Arch Poems and is the senior editor at Sojourners magazine. And she organized a religious peace pilgrimage to Ukraine in May of this year. Both Marie and Rose are editors of Advancing Nonviolence and Just Peace in the Church and the World. And we are so excited to have them here with us tonight.
And before we get started, our special guest, Bishop John Stowe, has joined us for a few opening words. And his name is showing up as James Bauer, but that's good enough. We know him as Bishop John Stowe. And we in the U.S. Church are lucky to have some bishops that are first and foremost about the issues of nonviolence, anti-war, nuclear disarmament, and Bishop Stowe shines in that category. So Bishop Stowe, we welcome you.
Thank you very much, David. It's great to be with all of you. I'm happy to see that this series is taking place and really proud of the great speakers and teachers that you have leading it. When I became a Franciscan more than 30 years ago, I was drawn to the simplicity of life of the Franciscan family, the way of living in community or fraternity with brothers, not concerned about advancement or accumulation or all the things that seem to be so attractive in the world of our times. But it was especially because Francis, in his own path of conversion, learned more and more how to be a man of peace. He wanted to radiate peace to others, but he had to root out all the tendencies to violence within himself. Part of his well-known conversion story happened after he found himself devastated in a war that he thought was going to bring him fame and glory and a title to his family. He found himself lost and bewildered and not sure what he was to do next. But he discovered that there was something greater in the peace and love of Christ and in the peaceful way of Jesus. And so he learned to renounce war and invite his followers to completely disavow themselves of the use of weapons or even the ability to defend themselves. Francis of Assisi became known for his interconnection and seeing the interconnections among all of creation, and that speaks so profoundly to us today. Brother and sister is the way that he addressed all creation, living and non-living. He also was able to reach out to the Muslims at a time during the Crusades, when Christians had so walked away from the vision of Christ that they were killing other people in order to reclaim the grounds where Christ was killed. It was so out of character in the larger picture of Christianity, but it reminds us how myopic we can be in our own times if we're not focused on what's most important. Now we have another Francis leading the church, Pope Francis, who is guiding us towards a more and more central role for the nonviolent characteristic of Christian spirituality and Christian life, especially with his World Day of Peace prayer and message in 2017, the 50th anniversary of the World Day of Peace being on January 1st, when he said, let us respect our deepest dignity and make active nonviolence our way of life. And as recently as yesterday in his Angelus, as he was noting tomorrow's 60th anniversary of the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, how it began with the threat of nuclear war all around us. And some 60 years later, we're still at the point of a threat of nuclear war all around us, but we've also have options before us to find a way of peace. So I'm so glad that all of you have the interest in learning about nonviolence and in converting your own lives so that you might be more and more open to being peace builders and to take the necessary steps to rooting out the violence that each of us finds within us. May the Lord bless the series and bless its speakers. May the Lord fill our hearts with his peace so that we might radiate that peace and reflect it to those around us. May we learn more and more what it is to walk in the footsteps of the humble Jesus of Nazareth, who was nonviolent and who told his disciples that his kingdom was not of this world. Come, Holy Spirit, fill our hearts with your peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you,
Amen.
Bishop Stowe. And Bishop Stowe, I failed to mention, is the Bishop of Lexington, Diocese of Lexington, Kentucky. And he's also the Bishop President of Pax Christi USA. Once again, thank you, Bishop, for your words and your prayer. And Anna, I'm going to turn it back to you if you have anything more to say in terms of introducing our speakers. Or if we're ready to go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo, thank you, Bishop, so much for being with us. And what you were saying reminded me of that at the church that my husband and I go to, they have a peace pole outside, and in lots of different languages, it says, let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me. And it's just a good reminder that every good thing that comes from us starts with us. And so it's a good invitation to self-reflection as we move into a broader view of nonviolence with Marie Dennis.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, Bishop Stowe. It's always a gift to listen to your message. So on Indigenous Peoples Day, as David mentioned, I too want to acknowledge with gratitude and deep respect the elders, both past and present, that I am speaking from the traditional land of the Anacostans, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey people. Thanks to Ken, Eliane, and Rosie, our October series on nonviolence was off to a stellar start last week. Ken reminded us that Jesus lived and taught nonviolence and invited us to follow in his footsteps, rejecting violence and killing, returning good for evil, healing divisions, and putting sacrificial love into action for just, peaceful, sustainable, and reconciled world. Nonviolence, Ken said, is at the heart of the way of the cross and the resurrection. He described the two hands of nonviolence, non-cooperation with injustice and steadfast regard for the other person. He also described briefly the work of Pax Christi International's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and pointed to Pope Francis' clearer and clearer embrace of nonviolence, as Bishop Stowe said. Eliane spoke about the nature of active nonviolence, how nonviolence, which is not the same as pacifism, is an orientation and a set of practices that stand against violence in its many forms with powerful and creative weapons, she said. She shared evidence that nonviolent civil resistance campaigns are twice as likely to succeed as violent campaigns and half as likely to fail. Important statistics. And Rosie shared her amazingly creative approach to understanding the many different faces of nonviolence. So it was a great beginning. So glad that you're back this week. This week, as David said, our theme is returning to and exploring the power of nonviolence. So maybe we could just begin by recognizing two very important signs of the times. The first is violence. It's obvious. We live in a global culture of violence, which includes not only specific physical acts of cruelty, but also local, national, and international systems of domination that destroy and diminish humans and the rest of creation as well. Violence is personal and interpersonal. It is war, it's street violence and gender violence. It's also structural and systemic, including the violence of poverty, of racism, the death penalty, preparations for war, trafficking in weapons, systems of political oppression, and the relentless destruction of our common home, planet Earth. The second sign of our times, however, is much more hopeful. It is a growing understanding and acceptance of nonviolence. For Pax Christi members around the world, nonviolence is a spirituality, a way of life, a deep commitment to live the values that we believe shaped the early Christian community in the first century context of occupied Palestine, where violence was a way of life. For us, the so-called hard sayings in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount are central. But the challenge is how to interpret that message in the context of a 21st century world immersed in extremely complex situations of violence. What does love your enemy mean now? Yes, at a personal level, but maybe even more importantly, what does this worldview often in a social context or politically, what does it mean in Ukraine right now? In the public arena, nonviolence is very often misrepresented, misunderstood, too narrowly defined, and wrongly dismissed as either passive or naive. Very strong evidence suggests, however, a very different conclusion, that active nonviolence, as we've said several times, is both powerful and effective. It is also much, much more than crossing a line or chaining oneself to a fence. It's much broader than civil resistance. In other words, nonviolence is not just not violent. It is active engagement in creative and proven effective strategies for building a more just and sustainable world. One of the great gifts of our age is the growing recognition of active nonviolence as a positive, constructive, and powerful force for social change, a process for ending violence, interrupting violence without using lethal force, for transforming conflict, for effectively protecting people and communities at risk, and for fostering just and peaceful alternatives. For decades, Pax Christi members around the world have been actively countering many different expressions of violence. Richly diverse, nonviolent tools and strategies have been the bread and butter for Pax Christi member organizations for decades. We've been involved in trainings in strategic nonviolence for communities that are negatively affected by extractive projects throughout Latin America, accompaniment of communities at risk in the Middle East, sports for peace programs in Haiti and South Sudan, reintegrating former combatants into their communities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, nonviolence trainings throughout Africa's Great Lakes region for young people and religious sisters, advocacy to reduce military spending and to support diplomatic solutions to seemingly intractable violent conflicts, and on and on. The list is really endless. After 9/11, with millions of people around the world, we said over and over, war is not the answer, to no avail. We began to ask what we could do then that would contribute to a worldwide shift from a perpetual logic of violence as the only way forward, which seemed to be the direction in which we headed after 9/11, and we've done so many other times. How could we shift from that logic, where it seemed as though violence was the only way, to a logic of nonviolence? And we began to think about the size and reach of Catholic institutions around the world. So we asked, what if 1.2 or 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide had a really full understanding of the power and effectiveness of active nonviolence and the connection of nonviolence to the heart of the gospel? What if we all knew how to apply nonviolent tools to diffuse conflict before it became violent? What if the Catholic Church committed its channels of communication and diplomacy, its vast spiritual, intellectual, and financial resources to promoting active nonviolence? What if Catholic schools, colleges, universities, and seminaries, all of the schools that you're attending, integrated programs on nonviolence and just peace into their curricula, into their research, into their community outreach efforts? It's wonderful to see so many universities participating in this series. It's exactly what we need to be doing. These questions and others were discussed at the small conference on nonviolence and just peace that Ken mentioned briefly last week. It was held in Rome in 2016 and was co-sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace and Pax Christi International. Among the 80 participants in that conference, and this is really important, were many people living in contexts of violence and war, from Iraq and Afghanistan, Palestine and Uganda, South Sudan and Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Sri Lanka, and many more. Many participants had very deep experience with applying effective nonviolence under extremely challenging circumstances. What they shared with us in those few days helped us to begin to develop a deeper, more nuanced, and more complex understanding of nonviolence as an option that is actively working to stop repression and violence, but as we've said repeatedly, is also working to promote social justice, human dignity, and a healthy planet. During the conference, we wrote an appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel nonviolence, urging the Catholic Church to follow the example of other faith communities, including the Quakers and the Mennonites, the United Church of Christ, the Church of the Brethren, and others, and to integrate gospel nonviolence explicitly into the life, including the sacramental life, and the work of the Church through dioceses, parishes, schools, universities, religious communities, and on and on. Adopting just peace as one example of a new nonviolent framework for Catholic teaching. Our message at that time on the just war tradition of the Church was very clear. We said, we believe that there is no just war. Too often the just war theory has been used to endorse rather than to prevent or limit war. Suggesting that a just war is possible also undermines the moral imperative to develop tools and capacities for nonviolent transformation of conflict. That was the quote from our appeal to the Church. It is time, we said, to replace just war thinking as the default response to potential or actual violence with a massive investment in nonviolent approaches that really make for peace. The Catholic Nonviolence Initiative then spent more than 2 years exploring contemporary Catholic practices of nonviolence and just peace in violent settings across the globe. Through this effort, it became clear that Catholics have a vibrant, if under-nurtured, spirituality of nonviolence that is deeply rooted in their relationship with Jesus, their closeness to Scripture, and in the intimacy of liturgy and personal or communal devotional practices. Deep Catholic faith has driven out indifference, educated for effective obstructive and constructive nonviolent practices, and provided communities experiencing conflict with transformational processes that keep conflict generative. Perhaps most important, those who engage in nonviolent practices generate by their actions a profound and contagious theological hope in those around them. In our book, Advancing Nonviolence and Just Peace, that Rose and I both were involved in editing, you can find many of the stories about effective nonviolent action in Kenya, in Croatia, the Philippines, the Central African Republic, Colombia, Mexico, Syria, Lebanon, and so on. We'll make sure you have a link to where you can find that book. Hope it's in your libraries. For example, in the Central African Republic, trauma healing teams stabilize communities in situations of extreme violence. In the Philippines, civilian land courts are decreasing violent property disputes through a restorative justice process. In northern Kenya, for over 8 years, one of our colleagues, Kanini Kamau, worked for 2 neighboring communities that had traditionally perceived each other as enemies. Whoever killed an enemy was praised as a hero. In a context of what was disorganized communal violence that was vulnerable, made people very vulnerable to political manipulation by armed militias, Kanini accompanied the communities as they learned nonviolent ways of interacting to reduce killing raids, to reestablish security, to stabilize communities, to resume restorative land practices, and to reestablish local self-reliance. We, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, the project of Pax Christi International, continue to listen very carefully to people from different contexts, believing that nonviolence in the context, for example, of occupation in Palestine, nonviolence in the context of poverty or street violence in Haiti, nonviolence from the perspective of liberation theologians in Latin America, nonviolence in Eastern Europe facing a frightening future, nonviolence intersecting with structural racism in the United States, nonviolence in post-colonial Africa, nonviolence in Myanmar following a military coup, nonviolence in Ukraine will all look very different. And each context needs its own nonviolent tools for transformation. So just 2 words about the war in Ukraine before Rose reflects on nonviolence in that very challenging context. The Ukraine war has greatly intensified the choice that we all have between life and death. Either we will continue to live our way into a new story of right relationships and commit to developing and scaling up diverse, powerful nonviolent tools that can address the root causes of conflict before it reaches catastrophic proportions, or we will remain stuck in an old story that believes that violence and war are inevitable. For as long as we humans fail to focus on making the shift to nonviolence that we are describing this week, military action will always appear to be the only option, creating, unfortunately, a platform for self-serving, powerful forces to fuel a new arms race, to recenter the insane and morally bankrupt strategy of nuclear deterrence, to dismiss the horrific loss of human life, damage to essential infrastructure. We've seen so much of it across Ukraine today, and wounding of the precious earth community wherever wars are fought. The realization of a new paradigm based on nonviolence is even more necessary than it was a year ago, and that is up to all of us. The Ukrainians are defending themselves as well as they can, but the rest of us have to create a new paradigm with which to move into the future. So thank you. It was great to be with you, and I'll turn it over to Rose.
Thanks, Marie. That was great. I just going to beg everyone's indulgence for a minute while I see if I can get this PowerPoint up and running. Anna, did you want to jump in for a second?
Sure. I just wanted to thank you again, Marie, so much. And just to share a couple of things that stood out to me. I am and so excited for this to be immediately followed up by Rose's testimony and witness. But the discussion of context, I think, was really striking to me, and that there's such a broad context for militarism and violence and warfare, and we have to really be prepared to match those contexts with the tools of nonviolence. I think that's just really striking, and something that I will be personally reflecting on and thinking about, and that it's seeking transformation, and that requires creativity. And so thank you again. And Rose, we're so excited to hear from you.
Let's see how we do here. How's that looking?
That looks beautiful.
All right, great. Well, always a pleasure to get to hear from Bishop Stowe and the ongoing work that Marie Dennis has done for so many years to really bring this idea of how the Catholic Church can lead and contribute in meaningful ways around the issue of nonviolence. It's just great and an honor to be here. I'm really going to give you one little example of the situation of the war in Ukraine, and how a group of interreligious leaders responded to that conflict. As most people know, there's been ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine for a number of years. But in February, Russian President Putin announced publicly that he would recognize Eastern Ukraine, the Eastern Ukraine regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. So that was the 21st of February. And then by the 24th of February in 2022, President Putin launches the special military operation in Eastern Ukraine. And within minutes, we see Russian missiles exploding in Kyiv, and in all the sites around the country, much as we have done and seen in the last 24 hours. The question that was on the minds of peacemakers around the world was, okay, this is actually happening. What do we do now? How do we respond nonviolently out of our Catholic teaching, understanding, faith, to make an active contribution to both stop violence and encourage a foundation of peace? And one of the things we were looking for was an invitation or a call from Ukraine at some level, some Ukrainians to say that it would be helpful to have input and presence from people outside of the Ukraine. And so on March the 4th, the mayor of Kyiv said, I make an appeal to the world's religious leaders to take a stand and assume the moral function that is incumbent upon them, and to proudly assume the responsibility of their religions for peace. Let us make Kyiv the capital of humanity, he said. Let us make it the capital of spirituality and peace. And this invitation, as we've come to learn more, is really built on Ukraine's 100 years of experience with nonviolence. So the map over here is just to make sure you know where Ukraine is in relation to things, and also because of the explosion of the bridge that's caused the most current round of violent strikes. I wanted to just note on there where that bridge actually is. So on March the 4th, we heard that call from the mayor of Kyiv, and the middle of May or the end of May, a group of, I think it was 17 interreligious leaders met in Warsaw and traveled from Warsaw to Kyiv by bus. And we traveled, you can see the little map there. It's, again, just to give you a little bit of, let's see, move so you can see Kyiv over there, give you a little bit of sense. So, this is Warsaw, Poland. These are all areas that were very much impacted during the Second World War for extermination camps. And then as you see where Chernobyl is over here, just to give you some, framing for what is some of the context for this region. We entered Ukraine through from Poland, and you see pictures of the border. We were traveling on a road that had been recently demined, and you see some pictures here of the bridges that had been blown up. We arrived in Kyiv, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, as many people know. But also you see in the image that's above my head, you see some of the preparations at that point, sandbagging some of their public art. The May 24th and 25th, this first interreligious peace delegation arrives in Kyiv, and we are really responding to that invitation that the mayor of Kyiv sent out. And our statements, crafted in collaboration with our Ukrainian hosts, were that, we are in Kyiv as people of faith, as a multi-religious and international delegation, the first of its kind to respond to the mayor's invitation, because our faith demands our presence here. And we've come to Kyiv in solidarity to pray for a just peace. Second, we demand that the bombing of Ukrainian cities stop. We are here because God demands that cities not be bombed. We, with the Russian blockade of the Ukrainian ports at that time and continuing, must stop. If we're to avoid hunger and humanitarian disaster, then grain must flow again from Ukraine. I think, as most people know by now, Ukraine is one of the primary exporters of grain to Africa and the Middle East. So no war is isolated. Every war is connected. The other key points that we were lifting up was that humanitarian aid should increase, humanitarian corridors should be provided, that we are open to praying in Moscow for a just peace with the faith communities in Russia, and that the war in Ukraine is not the only war. People are suffering in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, and in so many other places. Intervention of religious leaders in a form of public vigils for a just peace in cities endangered by bombing could provide an important instrument for peace building. And we hope this instrument can be used in Kyiv again and in other Ukrainian cities. We were able to meet with the Papal Nuncio, as you see here, who had very important and incisive look at what was happening in Ukraine and how he thought the Vatican could be instrumental in brokering some both relief to provide relief for civilians and creating an environment for diplomacy. We were met by representatives from President Zelensky's office, and who particularly wanted to say how pleased he was that there was an interreligious leaders, a group of interreligious leaders that included women, because too often, he said, religious delegations are only men. We held some public prayer services that garnered a lot of national attention in Ukraine, and I think were very encouraging to the Ukrainian people. And we held 2 prayer services. One of those was at Babyn Yar, which is the heart of the Jewish community in Kyiv, and the second was at St. Sophia's Cathedral, which is the heart of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. You see a little bit here, just following a press conference. We were also able to meet with the Association of Muslims of Ukraine, and these are the Tatar refugees. So when Russia took over Crimea, that created a whole flood of refugees coming from Crimea into Ukraine proper. And we were able to hear a lot of their stories and what they had endured during this most recent war in Ukraine. We were able to meet with the Greek Orthodox priests who were in Irpin and Bucha. Bucha is a site of war crimes, mass graves, terrible events took place there. And particularly this church, the Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox Church of the Nativity of Mary, was a place where the priests stayed during the Russian occupation. And more than 30 neighbors hid in the basement of this church, didn't leave it for 2 to 3 weeks while Russian soldiers and Ukrainian defense forces fought over their heads. And each day, one of the priests would sneak up to the sanctuary and bring the host down from the tabernacle so that they could celebrate Eucharist in their basement hiding places. And as they said, we celebrated each Eucharist as if it were our last. We were able to go to some of the places where Caritas was sending humanitarian aid, and hear how humanitarian aid serves as a component of nonviolence in any of these situations of conflict. We spoke there with, particularly some elders, and it just was poignant to us that many of these elders that had come to this camp, this Caritas camp, to escape the current violence from the Russian military, they were themselves Holocaust survivors. They'd either been in camps during World War II, or their parents had died in camps and they had been orphaned, at a very young age. And so just understanding the context that these elders not only survived very horrific atrocities as children that impacted their families, but they have survived the Soviet era, and now they are trying to survive Putin's most recent aggression and attacks. We were able to pray in the cultural center in Irpin that had been bombed by the Russian forces, and you see our group here. Part of what is the reality of modern warfare is this is not carpet bombing, this is targeted bombing. And so missiles, particularly missiles coming in from Russia, are targeted at cultural centers. They're targeted at civilian centers. They are aimed to demoralize the population and prepare it for occupation. We were able to meet finally with some of the high-ranking members of the mayor's office, and we were able to tell him that we were answering his call that he issued in March for an interreligious delegation to come to Kyiv, and he was able, his chief humanitarian officer was able to say to us, in the name of the mayor of Kyiv, I welcome you. And while we didn't have a lot of meetings set up with public officials before we arrived, as soon as we did arrive, we were very warmly embraced and had very good connections everywhere that we met. The city council and city officials of Kyiv are just highly respected around the country because they stayed during the war. They didn't take their government into exile. They have stayed in Kyiv and continue to work diligently for their people and for all of the refugees that are coming from areas out around the country to Kyiv for protection. I think one of the biggest, most informative connections for us was meeting with Archbishop Shevchuk, the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and his insights were really invaluable. He himself housed more than 500 people at their cathedral. He was called to pray over the mass graves in Bucha and Irpin as they were exhuming bodies. And he himself was on a death list. And so he told us, as he looked down into those graves that were being exhumed, he realized quite easily that could have been him, that could have been his body. He talked to us about how Ukrainians have left. He said they left in 3 waves. The wealthy went to Europe, then the middle class went to Western Ukraine, and now only the poorest and the weakest remain. The disabled, the elderly, and the very poor are now making up the population of Kyiv. I think one of his most transformative quotes to us was, humans can initiate war, but then humans become a slave of war. Only God can stop this war, and we must be prepared to cooperate with God. As I said, we held our second public prayer vigil in the plaza at St. Sophia's. In the most recent missile strikes, a missile landed about 1,000 meters from St. Sophia's. So it's very concerning that even though President Putin is arguing that he's sort of defending the faith, he is also aiming missiles at the heart of the faith, especially of Slavic Orthodoxy. Probably some of our significant meetings for some of the activists among us was meeting with a panel of peace builders and really learning about the work of trauma counseling, peace education, resistance to the Ruski Mir ideology, which is a part of the heresy that undergirds some of this attack. Learning more about humanitarian aid distribution and research that Ukrainians and others are doing on messaging, anti-war messaging inside of Russia. As I said, these are attacks on civilian neighborhoods, and so you see some of the places that we drove through. And this was a quote that I had at the end, as I'm here with Anglican Bishop Joe Bailey. I just said, I went to Ukraine to hear Jesus speak in the language of the Ukrainian people and to see their suffering and their creative determination to touch their wounds and to understand how the word of life is surviving there. What the value of this early delegation was that we began to gather anecdotal evidence about the civilian resistance and nonviolent responses by Ukrainians. Since that time, really just in the last 2 weeks, the data mapping of those nonviolent responses is beginning to manifest itself. And so some of the work that Philippe Daza has been doing is beginning to do intensive interviews with Ukrainians on the ground to figure out what are all the different kinds of nonviolent response that is happening in Ukraine in response to this level of violence. And while there have been many more actions than what he has recorded, it begins to give you a sense that the widespreadness of the nonviolent resistance, and that most of the resistance is happening in or near the temporarily occupied territories, which are the places that we get the least amount of information from. it's just, I'm just very impressed by the mapping that they are beginning to do and how they are separating out acts of non-cooperation, acts of nonviolent intervention, acts of protest. And yeah, Mac Bartkowski's quote here is, nonviolent civil defense is based on the fact that the entire population, including its institution and networks, are part of the resistance force. This force wages a daily war of total non-cooperation with the aggressor in all areas of social, political, economic, and cultural life. This opposition makes any invasion or subsequently occupation unsustainable in the long term. Now, this is just one piece of the vast span of what we understand as nonviolence, but it is a very specific actions and training that are taking place in a contemporary conflict that we're hearing a lot about. And it is, some people are doing this, doing these actions out of their faith and belief in peace. Most are doing them as a part of civilian resistance to an attack. So I think as I wind down, these are some of the reports that have been coming out that are doing really good analysis on what's happening in terms of nonviolence in Ukraine, and just my own work has been to try to write a feature article about our trip, which was in the cover of Sojourners, the cover feature. We've been doing ongoing work on our website at sojo.net, and we are just continuing to try to uncover what does Jesus's nonviolence look like in a very modern war. And the 100 years of nonviolence in Ukraine is showing up. This is not spontaneous responses. This is a culture that has been built and that has unity and cohesiveness to respond and defend its own history, its own multicultural complexity, and it is choosing very effective nonviolent strategies in which to defend itself. So I think I will close us up there. I know I'm happy to make these slides available, but this has also been recorded. And I look forward to seeing you at sojo.net and involved in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Thanks so much, everybody, for letting me share here.
All right, thank you so much, Rose. Wow, what a privileged look that we've gotten to have there. Whoop, water bottle's on the way. Something that struck me as a connection between what you, Marie, and Rose had to say is, Marie, you identified the practice of nonviolence in a modern context as being trying to model these nonviolent values of first century occupied Palestine. And then I really heard that being mirrored in the nonviolent resistance in Ukraine, in this coming together and sharing in common and sharing stories, and even like the breaking of the bread of the Eucharist, just really feels to me very much like church indeed.